so now that we've done a couple of examples of hypothesis testing, let's talk about some errors that could happen when we are doing these types of statistical analysis. So we do have two basic types of errors that we're going to talk about. Type 1 error, this occurs when the researcher rejects the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually true. So basically this means that they reject when they should have said, no, we are not rejecting this. So they conclude that there is evidence that the treatment had an effect, when in actuality it didn't have any effect at all. Now that might seem like something silly, but I want you to think about medically wise. If I give a medicine to a group of people and I come out and say, yes, this medicine worked and it had an effect, it was great, whatever, but in actuality, it didn't have an effect, and now I release that to the public, now I'm giving them medication that actually is not effective. So this is a pretty serious error when we think about different things. The same thing could be true if you're talking about a psychological treatment. If I think that the psychological treatment worked, and I did this study, and I said, yes, it worked, and then I release it to the public, it's not actually effective. Sometimes that can be actually more harmful than it is good because they think it's working, when in all actuality, it's probably not. So type 1 occurs when a researcher obtains an extreme non-representative sample. So basically that means that your sample automatically was significantly different from your population. So that's a big thing. So we can kind of manage this by looking at our sample before we even do the treatment to see if my sample is significantly different from my population. It's really about being able to obtain a sample that is representative of your population. That's kind of where our type 1 error tends to see the most type of problems. And again, remember that alpha level is that the chances of pulling a sample from a population that would be significantly different is like a 1% chance. Like if I said my alpha level was 0.01, that means that there's only a 1% chance that I'm going to pull a sample from a population that is that different from my population itself. Okay, my type 2 error, this occurs when the researcher fails to reject the null hypothesis when they should have rejected it. Okay, so this means that the researcher did not detect an effect of the treatment when a treatment was effective. Okay, so there was significant evidence to reject the null hypothesis, and the researcher says, nope, it didn't work. So a couple of things that we can talk about. Type 2 errors are related to what we call the power of a statistical test. And we're going to talk about the power of statistical tests in the next chapter. So the way that we can avoid this particular type of error, there's two big things we can do. We can increase the sample size. So a larger sample size increases the chance that the statistic will actually show the difference. And again, we'll talk about how that kind of works out in the next chapter and what happens when the difference between having a sample size of, like, say 4 and having a sample size of 30. And then the other thing you can do is increase the level of significance. So again, the most common level of significance is the 0.05, but you can use other levels of significance. So you could actually lower that to 0.10. It's one of those games we have to play to make sure that we are able to see an effect if an effect is present, and minimize our type 1 error where we see an effect when an effect is not present. So we're kind of playing this little game of what do we need to do. I'm going to tell you that the most common thing would be to increase your sample size. Larger sample sizes tend to be more accurate anyway, so we tend to like having sample sizes of at least 30 or more. So just kind of a summary of how our type 1 and type 2 errors occur. So again, if the researcher rejects the null hypothesis when in actuality there was no effect present, that would be a type 1 error. Okay, now if the researcher rejects the null hypothesis when the effect exists, so he's made the right decision. So that's he did right. If I reject the null hypothesis and the effect actually exists, I made the right decision. Now, our second option would be that they failed to reject the null hypothesis and there was no effect. That is also a correct decision. There was no difference between my population and my sample, therefore I failed to reject my null hypothesis. There was no effect between them. All right, now if I fail to reject, but there was actually a difference between my population and my sample, that's when I get my type 2 error. Okay, so I need you guys to make sure you understand where type 1 and type 2 errors come from, because there are going to be questions like that on your test on trying to determine if an instructor made a type 1 error or a type 2 error. Let me know if you have any questions.